The water was still that morning, February 13th, 2018. Lake Coeur d'Alene stretched out under a pale winter sky, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. A small boat drifted near the shore carrying a woman who was about to make a phone call that would unravel everything. 2 hours. That's how long she waited. 2 hours before dialing 911. 2 hours with the lake around her silent and vast. 2 hours to think, to decide, to prepare what she would say. Her husband was no longer in the boat. The sunrise they had come to watch was long gone by the time help arrived. And when rescuers reached the scene, they found a woman with a bloody nose, shivering, telling a story about a man who had simply fallen into the water. A story about a romantic morning gone wrong. A story that piece by piece would fall apart. What really happened on that boat? Why the delay? And why did nothing about this woman's story quite add up? Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Larry Eisenberg was born in Idaho in 1950, a true local who spent his entire life in the state. He grew up surrounded by forests and lakes, the kind of landscape that would shape his entire life. From an early age, he understood the value of hard work, a principle he would carry with him every single day until his last. He attended the University of Idaho, where he earned a degree in forestry. It was the natural choice for someone who had grown up watching the timber industry pulse through his community. After graduation, Larry built a solid career in the lumber business, eventually rising to become an executive in the industry. Colleagues knew him as tough, disciplined, and relentlessly frugal. He wasn't the type to waste money, and he wasn't the type to tolerate laziness. In 1974, Larry married his first wife. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter named Jessica and a son named Dean. He raised them with the same principles that guided his own life. Work hard, stay honest, be a straight arrow. His kids remember him saying things like that all the time, drilling into them the importance of integrity and effort. The marriage to Stephen lasted over 2 decades before ending in 1996. At 43 years old, Lori found herself a single mother, and she made a significant decision. She would start over in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. In this new city, Lori reinvented herself. She became deeply involved in community work, eventually earning the title of Volunteer of the Year from the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce. She was the kind of person who showed up at events, who remembered names, who made connections. Eventually, she rose to become the executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, a nonprofit organization tied to federal housing funds. It was a position of trust, a role that gave her access to significant resources meant to help those in need. To the outside world, Lori Barnes had overcome her difficult beginnings and become a pillar of her community. When Lori and Larry married, they brought together a blended family of 8 children, Larry's 2 and Lori's 6, along with 15 grandchildren and eventually a great-grandchild. It was a large, sprawling clan, and the couple embraced it fully. They owned a secluded cabin that they lovingly called Our Paradise, a place where the whole family would gather for holidays and celebrations. From the outside, the marriage looked like a fairy tale. Dean Eisenberg would later describe it as absolutely perfect. Friends used the word soulmates. A colleague who knew them both said Larry trusted Lori completely, without reservation. They traveled together constantly, visiting grandchildren, taking trips, building what appeared to be an ideal retirement. Lori's daughter, Chrislyn, would later recall how happy her mother seemed with Larry, noting the way he looked at Lori with genuine admiration. The stepchildren on both sides appeared to get along. Larry, despite being a tough and frugal man, had a warmth that extended to his new extended family. But certain details, invisible at the time, would later take on different meaning. Larry prided himself on fiscal responsibility. It was central to who he was, the man who taught his kids never to be lazy, never to waste, always to earn. He managed their money carefully, keeping track of every dollar. This was something Lori knew well. And yet, there was something Larry didn't know, something that existed in a parallel world, hidden from his view, growing larger and more dangerous with each passing month. The day was February 13th, 2018, a Tuesday, the day before Valentine's Day. Larry and Lori had plans. They would take their boat out on Lake Coeur d'Alene before sunrise to watch the dawn break over the water. It was the kind of romantic gesture that fit their public image as devoted partners. After the boat ride, they intended to have a special Valentine's breakfast together. They left their home while it was still dark, the winter cold, sharp and biting. The lake was quiet at that hour, the water dark and calm. They launched the boat and headed out onto the water, as the first hints of light began to appear on the horizon. According to Lori's account, everything was normal at first. They were out there together, watching the sky change colors, enjoying the peace of the early morning. Then she said something went wrong with the motor. Larry leaned toward it to investigate. He gave her a strange look. She would later mention something about stroke-like symptoms, a sudden change in his demeanor, and then he fell overboard into the frigid February water. That was her version. What happened next, according to the official timeline, was a gap, a period of approximately 2 hours during which Lori did not call for help. When asked about this later, she explained that she didn't want to leave the area where Larry had fallen, that she was searching, that she was hoping. At approximately 2 hours after the incident, she finally dialed 911. When rescuers arrived, they found Lori with visible injuries, a bloody nose, which she explained came from trying to save her husband. The boat was intact. Larry was nowhere to be found. The water temperature that morning was in the low 40s. In water that cold, survival time without rescue is measured in minutes, not hours. The search for Larry Eisenberg began immediately after the 911 call. Divers entered the frigid lake, and rescue teams scanned the water for any sign of him. Days passed. The community watched and waited. Lori gave interviews describing her grief, her shock, her devastation at losing her husband in such a tragic accident. About a week after the incident, Lori wrote a letter to friends and family, describing the morning in emotional detail, the trip to the lake, the accident, her desperate attempts to save him. The narrative she presented was one of a widow in mourning, but beneath the surface, investigators were already troubled. The 2-hour delay before calling 911 didn't sit right. The details of her story seemed to shift slightly with each telling. And then there were the injuries. Lori's bloody nose, which she attributed to rescue efforts, raised questions about what exactly happened on that boat. On March 1st, 2018, Larry Eisenberg's body was recovered from the lake, about 2.5 weeks after he disappeared. The discovery brought a measure of closure to those who had been waiting and hoping, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase, one that would reveal something no one expected. The autopsy that followed would change everything. When the medical examiner began the examination, they expected to find evidence consistent with drowning. A man in his late 60s falling into frigid water, his body submerged for weeks. The cause of death seemed obvious, but science told a different story. The medical examiner found something unexpected. Larry Eisenberg had not drowned. The cause of death was diphenhydramine toxicity, an overdose of Benadryl, the common antihistamine found in medicine cabinets across America. The concentration in his blood was 7,100 nanograms per milliliter, a level so far above therapeutic doses that it could only have been achieved through massive, deliberate ingestion. To put this in perspective, a normal dose produces blood levels far, far below what was found in Larry's system. This was no longer a tragic accident on a cold February morning. This was a homicide investigation. Suddenly, every detail took on new significance. The romantic sunrise trip, the motor problems, the strange look Lori described, the 2-hour galley, the letter to friends and family, carefully crafted to establish a narrative, the bloody nose. And then investigators discovered something else. On the very day Larry disappeared, Lori was exposed publicly for a completely different crime, one that would provide the missing piece to the puzzle. The double life Lori Eisenberg had been leading for years was about to collapse. As executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, Lori had access to federal funds intended to help low-income families with housing. Over a period of years, she had systematically stolen from this organization, creating false invoices and fake expenses, setting up shell companies in her daughter's names, and siphoning money into her own pockets and those of her children. The total amount she embezzled? Over careful letter to friends establishing an accident narrative. The court found Lori's explanation implausible. It simply didn't fit the facts. Larry's family members addressed the court with raw emotion. His daughter, Jessica McPherson, spoke of the permanent hole in her soul left by her father's death, and the impossibility of finding closure when the person responsible still refused to tell the truth. She described how Lori's offered plea, avoiding a full admission of guilt, felt like salt on the wounds. Even Lori's own stepdaughter, Amber, spoke against her. She testified that Larry had been a wonderful father figure and grandfather to her and her siblings. She told the court that her mother had manipulated the family, and that she and her sisters did not support Lori, did not stand by her. Looking back, Amber expressed regret that she hadn't cooperated with investigators earlier, before the full scope of her mother's deception became clear. The sentence was life in prison, with a minimum fixed term of 30 years before parole eligibility. Combined with her federal sentence for embezzlement, Lori Eisenberg will not be eligible for release until 2050, when she will be 97 years old. The case had split the family down the middle. Larry's 2 children lost their father and watched the woman who killed him escape a full murder conviction through a legal maneuver. They sat through hearings and sentencing, carrying grief that had no outlet, facing a woman who wouldn't fully admit what she had done. Lori's 6 daughters were left to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman who had stolen money using their names and then killed her husband to cover her crimes. The woman who had taught them to live right and make good choices had been living a lie for years, drawing them into her schemes, using their identities for fraud. One daughter, Chrislyn Woolston, had posted Lori's $75,000 bail after her arrest, believing in her mother despite the mounting evidence. When Lori later disappeared while out on bail, triggering a manhunt before she was eventually located, Chrislyn was left financially responsible for that bond. She later described the pain of realizing that her mother didn't care if she hurt her own daughter in her attempts to escape accountability. The woman who had raised her, who had taken her to church every Sunday, had abandoned her without a second thought. Another daughter, Amber, spoke publicly about the betrayal. On Dateline, she stated clearly, "We do not support her. We do not stand by her." The words carried the weight of shattered trust, of a mother-daughter bond irreparably broken. Lake Coeur d'Alene is still there, quiet and vast, reflecting the sky the way it did on that February morning in 2018. The water doesn't remember what happened. It just keeps moving, season after season, indifferent to the secrets that sank beneath its surface. Larry Eisenberg's children remember him differently than the headlines do. To them, he wasn't the victim in a murder case. He was the man who taught them about hard work and honesty. He was the father who took them hunting and fishing, who loved his dog Echo with pure, uncomplicated affection. He was someone who crossed items off his bucket list with childlike excitement, watching a rocket launch, riding a fan boat, learning to sail. At 68, Larry believed he had earned a peaceful retirement with the woman he loved. He trusted Lori completely. He had no idea that beneath the surface of their perfect marriage, a different reality was taking shape. One built on theft, deception, and ultimately betrayal. The case raises questions that extend beyond one family's tragedy. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What secrets can hide behind a familiar smile, a giddy laugh, a reputation for community service? And how does someone go from Community Volunteer of the Year to convicted murderer? There are no easy answers. Lori Eisenberg's path from poverty to nonprofit executive to killer was paved with small deceptions that grew into larger ones, with financial pressures that mounted until they became unbearable, with a willingness to prioritize self-preservation above everything else, including the life of the man who loved her. Lori Eisenberg is currently incarcerated at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She sits there with the consequences of her choices, while Larry's grandchildren grow up without him, while his children carry an absence that nothing can fill. The Paradise Cabin where the blended family once gathered sits empty of those memories now, its meaning forever changed. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some wounds don't heal with a verdict. But telling these stories matters, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember the people behind the cases. Larry Eisenberg was more than a crime statistic. He was someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone who believed in doing things the right way. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video. Your support helps bring more cases like this one to light, with the depth and respect they deserve. Because behind every headline, there's a human story waiting to be told.